Olá e bem-vindos ao Low-Key Português. Hoje vamos ver um pouco mais do português diário, uma agenda imersiva. So welcome back to Low-Key Portuguese. Today we're going to look at a few more pages in my agenda that I put together for Portuguese learners, early learners really, but I think this will help people at all stages. And whatever you can input into the agenda is really what will keep helping you practice and working through learning Portuguese. So here we have, again, just as the title page, and I'm just going to scroll down to a few things as you scroll through. And if you download this when I have it up, I'll put a link to this up at some point if there's any interest. Just let me know in the comments if you'd like to see this up for grabs somewhere. I'd like to keep it relatively affordable for people. I'm not trying to price gouge or anything like that. I'm really interested in people learning Portuguese. I spend a lot of time in Portugal, and I hear a lot of people speaking different languages, and I know that they would like to immerse themselves a bit more in the culture. And I think everybody would benefit if we could all communicate a little bit better. A little bit more ease in Portuguese, and I think it would make your experience in Portugal that much better if you're able to interact with the locals and start fostering relationships with people. What you see here on screen right now is my WhatsApp group. You can happily join if you'd like. Just follow that QR code, use your phone or any sort of device with a camera on it that has an internet connection. It'll bring you to a link to join my low-key Portuguese WhatsApp group. And in this group, it's just a group of like-minded people that are interested in learning Portuguese and are in the process at some point or other. There are people that are beginners, there are people that are intermediate, there are people that are advanced that are partaking in the group at this point. And all you have to do is really just join, and you'll see what it is once you get in there. There's really not much in terms of outside people trying to sell you things or anything like that. I may post things from time to time from my particular resources that I put together, but I try not to be too pushy with that sort of thing, and just provide links. And if you're interested, you are, and if you're not, then you're not. But ultimately, it's a community where people are going to connect with other learners who have a shared passion for Portuguese. You can ask questions on anything. You can share things that you've seen or that you're interacting with. It's just a space for all things European Portuguese. And again, it's a supportive environment. So as long as you want to partake in support and not come in and cause any problems, if you will, there's no pressure to join. Obviously, it's a free engagement tool, but I would suggest you take a look at it at some point. Anyway, just kind of going through here is all the niceties with what's going on in this book, what this is for. I'll spend a little more time on this later on, but at this point, it's really just here you have the glossary of all the terms that you're going to come across in the book that are not stipulated or defined in the moment on a specific page. These are just all of the items that you can find in the book that you may want to have a reference to. We looked at this one yesterday or in my last video, so check that video out. It's the verb to go, to talk about future events, intended events, or intended actions. And really, you also learn the correct form of the verb ir in the present tense, no presente do indicativo. This is the accompanying page, and if you as you scroll through, as you look at this document, you'll see that one page generally will have a practice exercise or a practice resource on the following page that kind of allows you to employ the things you learn on the previous page. It's not a textbook by any means or any way, shape, or form. It's kind of a learning guide that you use in your day-to-day, but also kind of gets you in the frame of mind and thinking in Portuguese. And I think that is the ultimate goal that most people have when they're trying to learn a foreign language. They'd like to do all things in that foreign language. They start thinking and dreaming and just interacting in everything related to that foreign language, that second language, that target language. So here today we're going to look at how to discuss actions that are happening in the present time frame or that habitually happens. And that happens with Portuguese with the verbal mode, o presente do indicativo. The indicative mode in Portuguese, o presente do indicativo, specifically talks about concrete events in the present tense. So it's not just things that are happening right now, this moment, but things that are happening in your present time frame. So when I talk about I work or I teach, for example, just to give you a clear example of this, I teach, this moment. I'm trying to teach you some Portuguese grammar, and but it's also something that I do for work. It's what my job entails. I am a teacher. It's what I classify myself as. It's what I do, right? It's what I tell people I do. It's what people know me as doing, right? I'm an educator. I teach. Em português é a mesma coisa. It's the same thing in Portuguese, where the present tense allows us to talk about, again, o indicativo, the indicative mode. This can occur in various time frames, but o presente indicativo is concrete actions in the present tense, that present time frame. But remember, it's that dual right now, this moment, or habitually happen in the present. Okay. It's not I taught yesterday. It's I teach right now, or I teach in the present. That's what I do for a living at this point. So we're going to go back to the idea of infinitives. We talked about this yesterday or in the last video with the verb to go, verb ir. Ir is the infinitive. It's the verb without a subject, right? It's just the idea of going. Here we're going to look at another one. We're going to look at the verb mudar. Okay, the verb mudar means to change. But if you see here, there's nobody changing. It's just the idea, the concept of to change, right? So when I talk about infinitives, that's what I'm referring to. And they're largely going to be three forms: AR, ER, and IR. And again, the endings are what I'm referring to. So this is an AR verb. It's a regular AR verb. And that's what we're focusing on today. There are plenty of irregular verbs, but today we're going to focus on regular AR verbs, regular ER verbs, and regular IR verbs. And I'll explain why we're going to do this. A lot of textbooks like to split this up into three different things to think about. There's also OR verbs, but they're very few and far between. So we're going to focus on AR, ER, and IR, and kind of look at those similarities to help you kind of standardize or at least come to a better understanding of how to approach these as we progress through here. So again, we're going to use the verb mudar as our example. But what we want to do with all of our infinitives, once we decide which time frame we're going to narrate, in this case, we're going to stick with presente indicativo. We can do past and future at other points. I gave you the future yesterday in the last video, the verb to go video. That's when you want to check out eat. Maybe I could put a card somewhere on the screen once I figure that out, to be perfectly honest with you, on YouTube. So first we want to remove the AR ending and then apply the il, like the I, and the to informal you endings, just to kind of show you some examples. And we'll look at all of them all together. So here we have the verb mudar, again, with our AR ending for our infinitive, right? Our verb without a subject. We're going to remove the AR ending, okay, and just keep the mud, okay? And then we're going to apply, in this case, the ending for I, for eu, okay? Eu mudo de ideias. Eu mudo de ideias. Eu mudo de ideias. Just to give you a few different ways in which you might hear that being said. So when I talk about agreement, I'm talking about that ending that we apply has to agree with the subject. And in Portuguese, a lot of the subject pronouns are going to agree with a specific ending. So in this case, we're looking at subject I, and this is literally saying, I change my mind. Eu mudo de ideias. Okay, ideias looks like a nice, like ideas, right? But the expression we would use in English is my mind. Eu mudo de ideias. And now let's look at and see what happens if I apply the ending that typically goes with tu. Tu mudas de atitude num instante. Okay, tu mudas de atitude num instante. So here I'm applying the ending as, which is our regular AR verb ending for informal you, for tu. And I used a few cognates here just to kind of help you out and make you realize that, hopefully have you realize that a lot of the words that you're going to work with in Portuguese ultimately have very similar feels to them. Like you can look at them and kind of come to a somewhat of an educated guess as to what they mean. So these are called cognates, by the way, just in case you hear me say that term. That's what I'm referring to. Words in your native language that look very similar in the target language. So here we have tu mudas, you change, but remember, this is our informal you. Tu mudas de atitude, you change your attitude, or change of attitude. Doesn't translate well. We can't really sit here and translate word for word. We want to translate concepts, but some things we can really look at and help us make that adjustment, make that translation of concepts happen. So tu mudas de atitude, that means you change your attitude num instante. So in an instant. So instante, if you can see it, looks very much like the English term instant, right? You change your attitude in an instant. And if you notice, we'll talk about these prepositions at some point, because these are very complex and difficult to deal with because a lot of them don't translate well into English. Again, we don't want to translate word for word. We want to translate concepts. So once we start understanding the bare bones and the structures of how these things work, we'll tackle those, or I'll create videos to tackle those prepositions and prepositional phrases, because that's what's happening here with nu. It's really ein plus for anybody that's already been playing the home game or that's been learning Portuguese for a while. You'll realize that it's the contraction of the preposition ein with the indefinite article an, or some. In this case, it's just an instant because we were dealing with a vocalic sound, but in Portuguese, that doesn't really matter. We'll talk about that another point. So we're really saying you change your attitude in an instant. Tu mudas de atitude num instante. So now I want to show you the endings for regular AR verbs and a few things to take note of. So for eu, the ending across the board for AR, ER, and IR verbs relative to the subject pronoun eu is for I. So anytime you're referring to yourself doing something in the present tense, the presente indicativo, either in the moment or, in that habitual present tense kind of feel, they're going to end in u, the sound u. Okay. And we'll look at it in a couple of examples in a moment as to how this is going to play out. So eu, u, and u for ER, AR verbs, ER verbs, and IR verbs. And you'll see some similarities amongst all of them, and then amongst a couple of the different groupings here. So for tu, for our informal you, tu, okay, tu, the ending for AR verbs is ej, okay, as, ej. For ER verbs, ej. And the same thing for IR verbs. So if you'll notice, ER verbs and IR verbs are going to have the same endings except for one subject line, except for one, okay? So for você, for our formal you, the ending is just going to be for AR verbs, and then the E or A for ER and IR verbs. If you'll notice, você with ele and ela, with he and she, these all share the same endings. And that's going to be the case for pretty much all AR, ER, and IR verbs. That's just the rule. Like the third person singular, the formal you, second person singular, formal you, so our you formal, você. We can talk about that pronoun in a specific video just to work that a little bit more, but just know that in Portuguese you have these distinctions between informal and formal you. And there's also a plural you that we'll get to. And there's actually another formal you plural that we never really use. It's kind of an archaic form, so I don't even bring it up in these videos. You don't really need to know that unless maybe you have family along some of the more interior villages that might still employ that more archaic form of Portuguese, but for the most part, standardized Portuguese is not going to deal with vós, okay? So anyway, so we have você, ele, and ela. So ele, ela, is he and she. And I'll just touch upon ele and ela real quick because it allows us to talk about this sound that oftentimes gets kind of difficult for non-native speakers of Portuguese. The E that comes at the end of a word in Portuguese, and there's lots of these words where it's preceded by a consonant. Okay, so what the E does is two things. It's there, right? We're pronouncing it in an unstressed way, but it's really helping us kind of soften that consonant that comes beforehand. So instead of, it's not L, like the Spanish L and La. It's not that L. It's not that. It's il, il. And if you hear the way that I pronounce that, it's there, the il, but I'm really it's just kind of trailing off. It's not something that I'm leaning into, that I'm overly pronouncing. And it's really helping me to soften that L. Il, okay, il. And then with she, ela, il, ela, ella. Okay. And again, these all share the same endings for the conjugation of verbs. So if you want to say that he or she changes, ele muda, ela muda, você muda. Okay? And then we're going to look at we, our first person plural. So nós. Okay? The S sound at the end of Portuguese words is also something I'd like to touch upon. And we can spend time in another video looking at this a little bit more, but I'll just bring it up real quick. So nós, if you notice that sound at the end is not the nós. It's not nós. Some Brazilians might pronounce that some way, but in Portugal, it's always going to have more of a ZJ kind of blend. Nós. Okay? So if we're going to look at the verb mudar, nós mudamos. Okay? Nós mudamos. If we're going to look at an ER verb, it would have an EMOS ending. And I'm going to bring up the verb comer, to eat. and the verb partir, to depart. Okay, just to use kind of two verbs that have an er and an ir ending. So if we're going to say we eat, nós comemos, emos. And then for IMOS, this is where there's a distinction between all three regular AR, ER, and IR verbs. It's in that first person plural in the we form, nós. Nós mudamos, nós comemos e nós partimos. Nós partimos. Okay, we depart. Nós partimos. And that's really it in terms of distinctions between all three. So if you're wondering why we have to do all three, that's why. It's that first person plural where there's a change across the board. In other verbal forms, similar things will happen. But again, we're just focusing on presente indicativo, concrete actions in the present. And then finally, we have the last line of verb conjugations, and these all share the same thing. So like third person singular, eles and elas, which is they. Eles is they mixed or male for an all male group or a mixed group. And it can be, the ratio doesn't matter. As long as there's one male and one female, it's going to be eles. Okay. It doesn't matter if there's 2,000 females and one male in that group, it's still going to be eles. Okay. It's only when it's an all female group that it becomes elas. Okay. So just use the same verbs that we've been thinking about: mudar, comer, and partir. Eles mudam. Elas mudam, eles comem, elas comem, eles partem, elas partem. Okay, and the same thing is going to be the same pronunciation for vocês, for our you plural. Vocês mudam, you guys, all of you mudam, vocês comem e vocês partem. So I just want to touch upon the pronunciation of this AM, EM, and EM ending here.